these issues require that we understand our purposes for schooling, why we have schooling, as well as our aims, like our goals and our vision, what we hope to achieve through schooling. I am going to very briefly tell you a little bit about myself. One, that I'm from Minnesota and just moved back to Minnesota, so I'm calling you from Minnesota, but I went via St. Louis, DC, South Africa, California, and New York to get back here, and really see myself as a global citizen and a seeker in that, and that in Minnesota, I come from an educator mom and a family of educators, so education has really been in my blood since really the very beginning. And Omid, you did a great job talking about South Africa, but I actually spent 5 years in South Africa starting a library. It was not in a 3-month trip, I promise, but I did get to go back for the 10-year anniversary last year, and we built a new, I got to work with my same team is still running the library, and we got to build a new literacy area for children for the 10-year anniversary, which was really wonderful. But so I also consider myself an educator and a longtime educator, over 20 years working in education, but simultaneously a doer. And not that those have to be intention, but someone who likes to start and build things. I am absolutely a nerd. In my better times, I can call that a thinker. But I read voraciously, and the reason I came to do my PhD was not so much for the degree, but because I had spent 10 years in international development and just saw that it wasn't working for my kids. It was not working. And at that time, I think I was still naive enough to think that there were a group of experts somewhere who just knew the answers. And so if I could go and just find out the answer from them, they could tell me and I could go back out in the world and do the right answer. That didn't work out exactly right, but I did get to learn a lot, some of which I'll get to share today with you. And today I am still working in education, but on the side of working with schools and organizations. So I'm the Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at an organization called Choice-Filled Lives Network, which, Omid, I don't think you even knew that yet. It is that new, a couple months old, and the co-founder of Re-Envision Ed. And in both, I work with vision and mission aligned organizations to think about both systems change and institutional change. So strategy, vision, mission, research, evaluation, how do we kind of become better and better at doing what we do so we can make the difference we want to see in the world. I loved in particular that a couple people brought up how this interplays with our own personal lives, because we are all humans and we are all constantly learning in our own lives and thinking about what it is we want. And so I actually want to start, and I want everyone to, I'm going to literally ask you all this. And I'm going to ask you to put it in the chat, your answer, but we're going to popcorn out a couple if people feel comfortable. So I want you to think about this for a second. You know, think about a kid that you care about. This is not other people's children. Maybe it's your own child. Maybe it's a niece or nephew, but it's not a broad generalized child. Maybe it's your best friend's child. I don't have my own children yet, but I have both a niece and 20 years of working with children. And all of my friends have kids. So I want you to think about a specific kid you care about, and I want you to think about them grown up, maybe in their 30s, living their life. What is a good life? So my dissertation and my life's work is fundamentally about how we create schooling systems that help everyone create these kinds of lives that we want for the kids that we care about, for everyone. Because it turns out that when we talk across the country, across lines of difference, there is not much difference in how we describe the kinds of lives that we hope for our children. I explore the ways we need to rethink both why we have schools and how we do school, and what that means for how we need to reconceptualize that relationship between school and society. We're going to go big picture through a lot today because I think about systems change all the way down to the design of actual classrooms. And I'm going to actually take you through that high level to think about those links from the big picture of why we have school all the way down to what it means to design school. I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. And I'm going to ask if you could to just save your questions, unless it's a clarification question. You know, if you're like, wait, I just didn't literally understand that, please ask me. But otherwise, if you have content questions, save it, because I'm hoping that we'll have a good discussion towards the end across all of these things. And I'm always available to discuss in the future. Is that all right with everybody? So schools are important. This might be an obvious point, considering we are all sitting here working in education and thinking about school from an academic sense and from a practical sense. But students spend about 14,000 hours in school between the age of 5 and 18, and schools are our primary socializing institution. So we would hope that they would promote, right, the well-being and growth of our children and lend themselves to a thriving democratic society. I think it was John that talked a little bit about citizenship and connection to school for everybody. And yet, right, there are plenty of problems, which we also all know. Across the board, kids report being disengaged and discouraged. Only 54% of students feel hopeful about their prospects in future or in school, or their ability to achieve their goals. A full third of students, and this is pre-pandemic, by the way, this is a couple of years ago from a Gallup poll, so 34% of students report they are actually suffering in school. At the lower end of the socioeconomic system, right, kids are 5 times more likely to drop out of schools if they're in poor communities. There are high levels of disengagement, demotivation. At the higher end of the socioeconomic system, so I lived in Palo Alto for 9 years, where we have some of the wealthiest schools and communities in the country. There are high rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide. We had three clusters of suicides, I think, in 10 years. And adults in schools don't seem to be better off, right? Teacher and principal burnout is high. Nearly half, 41% of teachers leave within their first 5 years. And over half of principals leave before the end of their 3rd year. And funny fact is that principals are most effective at the end of their 5th year. But about half of them leave by the end of their 3rd year. We have tried lots of different ways. I taught the history of school reform at Stanford for a number of years with David Lavery. It turns out we have a long history of school reform, just as about as long as we have school. And we have tried lots of ways of solving these problems. There are additional resources like therapists being offered for psychological well-being. Programs have been created to increase engagement. Teachers invest energy in technology and curricula to connect with student experience. Lots of incentives have been put in place to try and retain teachers and administrators. One of my main arguments is that while these programs are important for the individuals they help, they're simply solving symptoms rather than root causes. A metaphor for the difference between root causes and symptoms could be if there were a factory polluting a town's water source, or for instance, given the times we're living in, a pandemic, right? Going around in a population. In this case, the polluted water or a virus causes a range of symptoms. For some people, nothing. Other people develop joint issues or a cough, right? And while it's important to treat those individual illnesses, this is just really triage. Unless you clean the water, unless you develop a vaccine, unless you fix the environment, it's just going to be developing anew in individuals. And while some individuals may be more susceptible to illness, the cause of the illness is in their environment. It's not in their person. And I especially point that last piece out. And I think right now, the moment we're in help explain that, because we often talk about and research these problems in schooling in particular, as if the individuals themselves have something wrong with them, right? And we have to figure out how to fix them. The equivalent question from our polluted water metaphor might be pointing out that the community up the road has clean water, by the way, and saying, see, those people don't have an issue. They're not getting sick. Why don't we just help the people in the town down the road get stronger immune systems, right? We are oftentimes framing the issue as one of being located in individuals when it's actually located in the systems. Anytime you have pattern symptoms, across an environment, the issue is in the environment, not in the individual. And how do we know for sure that it's a systems issue? We know for sure it's a systems issue because the symptoms are widespread and they're patterned, right? Like across different kinds of high wealthy areas, high SES areas, the same symptoms are cropping up in those students. In low SES areas, the same symptoms are cropping up, which means it's not an issue with those students, right? Also, school reform is steady work. One of the biggest things with systems problems is that when you try and solve something, another problem just pops up next door. And this is kind of the history of school reform. So you know you're not getting at a root cause issue. when you just keep having kind of a whack-a-mole of problems happening. And also we know it's a systems issue because of common sense. Because when you look at the problems that we're facing, it's so clear that it is not the kids that are the problem, that we've created a system that doesn't fit the kids and frankly doesn't fit the adults. But how do you shift a system? And this is what I spent the first 4 years of my PhD basically getting to and I moved across a lot of bodies of literature. I went from literacy to second language acquisition, to socio-emotional development, to character development, to history of school reform, to sociology, and really came to this understanding that, okay, it's actually not going to be a new curriculum. It's not going to be a new literacy approach. We're going to have to change the system if we want to fundamentally solve some of these problems. This is my 5-point radically simplified set of steps for shifting a system. The first one is just that you have to see that it's a systems issue, right? You have to stop trying to only solve things through triage. And it doesn't mean that you stop the triage, but you have to start seeing that that is always going to be triage. The next step is that schooling is a teleological system. It has a purpose, right? This means that truly solving these issues require that we understand our purposes for schooling, why we have schooling, as well as our aims, like our goals and our vision, what we hope to achieve through schooling. In other words, we have to answer the question, why school? As the old adage says, if you don't know where you're going, how will you know when you get there? So the first step is really agreeing on what we're meant to do. Then you have to have a shared vision that comes out of it. You have to know where it is you're headed, what kind of society we want to create, what kind of lives. But then, which may seem obvious, you have to understand how you actually do that vision. What does that mean for the actual practice of school? It's great to be theoretical and sitting at Stanford with your beautiful ideas about what the purpose is and what your vision is. But you have to be able to see the system in its interrelated parts and how the practice of school today connects with that bigger picture. And then, of course, you have to do the hard change work. And none of those steps are particularly easy. And so again, today I'm going to be taking a big bird's eye view. So please forgive me, as many of the details are not going to be in here, but I'm, again, always happy to talk about it. And I'd always be happy to also share the full dissertation. I see both this talk and kind of all of this work is never the end, but part of beginning of conversations, right? I think it's how we talk about it, how we start thinking about the problems we're solving that matters. So what are the purposes of schooling? And this is, again, not going to be a rhetorical question. I am going to ask you to think about this. What is, to you, the purpose of school? Assumptions about the purposes of school and the aims of schooling drive educational research, funding, and the solutions that we and others develop, right? And yet, these assumptions are rarely made explicit. This is one of the things that I found when I was reading across the different disciplines. Almost everyone had a different assumption about what school was meant to be doing, and then they were finding problems with the way that school was doing it, and setting out solutions for schools in the ways that they should be better at doing the thing that they thought they should be doing. And yet, those weren't in conversations with one another. So one of the first things I found was that we needed a way of putting all of these different kinds of answers in conversation with one another. So I set about trying to build a meta framework for the purposes of schooling. So a meta framework takes different frames or frameworks and puts them in conversation with one another. It helps make assumptions visible, right? So we can see more clearly and actually have conversations across frames. It allows us to disentangle different purposes and discern and also make some choices once we're in discussion with one another about what are the purposes we actually want. What do we want to be working for and towards that we want for school? What is school's problem? What is not school's problem? I'm going to do a quick definition of terms. I found this useful, but I also think it's confusing if you're not in this every day. But there is a difference between purposes and aims, and this will come out very clearly as we move forward through this. But purposes are reasons why we have why we have schooling as an institution. Like, what are the roles it plays in individuals' lives in society? And this is true across any society that has schooling as an institution. I have 4 purposes. They answer, why do we have schools? And I think these are objective. I think this is just true. But the specific outcomes we want to create in a particular society, whether we are Plato's Republic, modern day US, or France in the late 1800s, right? Or apartheid South Africa, right? Like, this is morally not, it is that our visions and our aims are normative, right? It depends on what it is we're trying to create. For example, every nation state might justify the existence of schooling by saying it wants to socialize citizens, right, into its national identity. But that's a purpose. But what the desired national identity is, right? Say even just modern day, what the identity of Ukraine is versus the identity of the United States, kind of who it is we're trying to develop into as a community are different. And those are the aims. Does that make sense? I'm looking at your faces, like, just for a quick nod. I know it's high level and quick. Here's the basics of a meta framework. It goes from, they differ along 2 main dimensions, purposes. So the extent to which they're individual or collective, and intrinsic and instrumental. I think individual to collective is fairly intuitive, right? Individual purposes are reasons an individual might pursue and invest in schooling themselves. These take the perspective and focus on the needs of the individual. Purposes, collective purposes, are those that relate to and from the perspective of the whole society. They could be thought of as the reason a society would invest in schooling, kind of above and beyond what individuals could expect to invest. Intrinsic instrumental is a little bit more, it takes a little more explaining, less intuitive. So intrinsic purposes relate to the actual process and practice of school itself. It's how we structure, manage, teach, and learn in schools. So aims are achieved here through the actual lived experience of schooling, the pedagogy and the community. It's intrinsic to the experience of school, right? The outcomes are variable and can be quite different depending on what kind of experience you have. So if you have really rote learning experience, that your outcome is going to be different than if you have Montessori exploratory schooling, right? The outcomes are different. Instrumental purposes then are ways the society or the individual use schooling as an institution to try and get other socioeconomic outcomes. This is going to make more sense when I put the purposes on, but it's helpful to just think about the axes. So instrumental purposes have aims that are related to efficiently maintaining economic and political institutions that currently exist, right? So your outcomes are predetermined because it's what is society now. It's how you navigate the current institutions. How do I get into college? How do I make sure to get a good job, right? Like, which means what are the good jobs right now? So the presumed outcomes are constant. I don't know if any of you know Danielle Allen. She's one of my favorite philosophers and philosophers of education. She's at Harvard now, but she talks about how you can tell that a frame is instrumental because the discussions ignore the practice of education itself. They focus on the funding, allocation, or distribution of some kind of good called education, but aren't particularly concerned with whatever the actual good is. It's not about what actually happens in school. Our four purposes. Here are the 4 purposes of school, the 4 different frames that we use. So individual possibility, the learning and development of individual humans is kind of what we might classically call the education of individual, to Omid's point about growth, right? Oftentimes it's best aligned with Dewey's assertion that education is growth. It is oftentimes in the Aristotelian sense, the desire to develop each individual to their fullest potential, whatever that vision of potential is within a particular society. And from this perspective, schools are organized for individual children to cultivate the skills, the mindsets, and the understanding of their self to participate now and as adults in the world. Some questions that are asked here might be, how do children develop deep content knowledge and the ability to apply it? Or how do I make sure my child develops a sense of empathy or of wonder? Or how do we make sure all kids learn algebra, right? These are the kinds of questions that are in the individual possibility framing. The social possibility framing, the collective intrinsic purpose for schooling, goes beyond the individual to the continuation and renewal of society. This purpose is to create a culture and a society by socializing students into a way of being and interacting with others, right? And we do this at the micro level within a school community, as well as a sense of national identity, who we are as Americans, right? This imagined community of who we are as Americans is largely promulgated through school. It actually was the original purpose for school. The aims here are largely socialization processes. It's like, who is the kind of country we want to be, and how do we socialize kids into it? Sociologists of education and political philosophers often frame their work here. So questions that are asked here might be, how to create a local or national sense of identity? What does it mean to be American, and how do schools create that? I have one friend who actually is doing her work on that. Or something like, how do we help foster democratic values? It's interesting, 3 years ago when I finished this, that wasn't as big of a question, interestingly, in 2017 as it is now. Social efficiency here, the collective instrumental framing for schooling, is about the reproduction and maintenance of current social, political, and economic institutions. Social efficiency is not about directly shaping individuals and their relations through the process of school, the way social possibility is, but it's rather about filling the societal needs for particular kinds of people. Right? We need workers, we need STEM workers, we need people who can code, we need nurses, we need politicians, we need street cleaners, right? Like, we need all of these things as a society, and social efficiency looks at it with that frame. So the outcomes are predefined based on current institutions and what we need. I think a lot about the programs right now that are about teaching kids to code, right? This is a classic social efficiency, but also a lot of the work from economists and political scientists are very likely to frame their work from this purpose. So this includes things like, how do we ensure there are enough STEM workers, but how do we make sure our national economic growth can compete with China's? Like, all this research on, like, oh, well, a country that invests in its schooling system has X% more economic growth every year than the schooling system, than the countries that don't, right? These are all social efficiency kind of views of what the purpose of school is and what school should do. Individual efficiency, so it is the same as social efficiency, but from an individual perspective, right? It's how do individuals use schooling to maximize outcomes in the current economic and political system? So this purpose for schooling acknowledges that in any given current system, individuals will, on the whole, seek to ensure the best possible outcomes for themselves, right? That everybody's looking to kind of figure out how to make sure to be okay, and for their kids. In an unequal capitalist system, for instance, individual efficiency is largely about social mobility. So economists, policymakers, and reformers today a lot of times frame their work here. And we often, questions here include things like, how do we make sure every child graduates from high school or college, right? Notice that those aren't about the experience of their schooling, but rather about, if they graduate from high school, they're more likely to get a job when they're done, or they're more likely to get into college when they're done. It's about navigating the system rather than about kind of, what do we want to make sure every student experiences in high school or comes out of high school with, right? Or some questions like, how do I make sure my child gets into Stanford, right? Like, and I think today individual efficiency is largely the way we frame the purpose of school. And it's implicit in a lot of the reforms, research at Stanford when I was there, the individual programs, and a lot of nonprofits work. You could think of the underlying question here as being one of, how do we make sure poor kids can compete with wealthy kids for an ever decreasing number of jobs at the top, right? It's like, how do we make sure that, that every kid has an equal opportunity to end up at the top of our very unequal system? And one of the things I argue is that this is a particularly damaging place to frame the purpose of schooling from. I think it undermines both our individual flourishing and our ability to evolve and thrive as a society. In general, efficiency purposes define ends and very quickly become a case of the ends justify the means. We see this in our schooling or in our testing regimes, right? for instance, for a different example, we look at the situation and we see that having a college degree makes it more likely you're going to end up being in the top 50% of wage earners, right? So we start programs and we implement policies to make sure that everyone gets a college degree. But then suddenly, not only does this mean there aren't jobs for everyone with a college degree at that higher wage, but what students are meant to actually get out of college degree in a broader sense starts getting ignored, right? So framing the purpose here in efficiency makes school a field of competition for limited places at the economic table very often. And it ignores the fact from a macro perspective, when you look at this from a systems perspective, if 50% of jobs don't pay a living wage, then 50% of people won't have a living wage. It's not something schools can solve. It's a economics problem. it's a macroeconomics problem, right? And it ends up being something where we have very individually rational choices and programs and interventions that end up being collectively irrational. Another one of my favorite philosophers, Randall Curran. And I think it also allows us to sidestep the hard questions and the conversations we need to have as a society about economic inequality. When we frame it instead as competition rather than questioning the field, right? I think about it that I don't want to level the playing field. I want to change the game. And think about this. Meanwhile, individual and social possibility about means and renewal. And I am not, one thing I want to say here is that I am not saying that reproduction is bad. Okay, reproduction, we need reproduction. We need a way that we're not reinventing the wheel every generation. We need a way of passing down knowledge from generation to generation. Both are important, but when we design the actual experience of school, it needs to come from these possibility purposes. So kind of a summary from this part of it. There are 4 purposes for schooling: individual and collective, possibility and efficiency purposes. The aims differ by society, but across the board, if you want to achieve all 4 of your purposes, we need to be thinking about the design of school in the individual and social possibility frames, about what happens actually in school, not designing for an outcome that's outside of the school. But today we largely use an efficiency frame when we talk about school.